in November, one of the later Sundays in November. It's the collect that was written initially by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer back in the 16th century. And if you were here last week, you'll remember that those words are a little strange, aren't they? That we're called to read, mark, and learn. I get that. But inwardly digest the scriptures? Well, what does that mean? Well, if you'll recall, once again, if you were here last week, those are images that are taken from the prophet Jeremiah, the prophet Ezekiel, and from the book of Revelation, where the prophet Jeremiah says that he takes the scroll that he's been handed and he eats it. He digests the Holy Scriptures. I mean, that's how we're called to be so intimately related to the Scriptures. We're called to digest them and make them a part of our bodies, a part of who we are. And the prophets, all the people of Israel, knew that we were called to read Scripture in community. That's just so important to remember, that this is a communal undertaking, reading Scripture. It's not something, certainly it's something that we can do for our private devotions, and we should do it for our private devotions, and we should do it for our private study. But ultimately, we come to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest the Scriptures in community. And isn't that a perfect dovetail with Deut's wonderful sermon this morning, where he reminded us that the purpose of the church is to be a place of hope, to be a community of hope. I served in the Diocese of Texas for many years before we came out here, and there's a wonderful organization that's called Community of Hope in the diocese, and many parishes, included the ones where I served, have communities of hope, and they're all about empowering lay people to offer pastoral care to the community. And so it's really a tangible expression of how communities like Epiphany are called to be communities of hope. So just a brief recap from last week for those who weren't there, and for those who, like me, have a real short memory. We read, learn, and inwardly digest these scriptures. And as Anglicans, we read scripture through the lens of tradition and using our God-given faculties of reason. So we don't suspend reason. We don't suspend all the things we know and learn, have known and learned over the years. We don't suspend our logical minds, our reasoning minds, when we read Scripture, but we use those in the project of interpreting Scripture. So we also want to remember that part of that project, and this is deeply rooted in the Anglican tradition, is to recall the context in which the Scriptures were written. So we always want to ask ourselves, as we're reading the Bible, who was the audience for this? Who was the original writer thinking about and writing to and writing for on this particular piece of Scripture? It's critical that we understand that. Otherwise, we're reading Scripture in the abstract. We're reading Scripture sort of in the ether somewhere. And that leads to all kinds of pernicious stuff, like us hanging our own prejudices and our own wants for the Scripture to say what we want it to say on the Scriptures. So we're always looking for context. Who was the audience? What were they listening for? What did they need to hear? What did they want to hear? And then when we know that, when we know who the Scriptures were originally speaking to, then we can bring the Scriptures forward so they can speak into our lives today. But before we do that, we first need to understand who the Scriptures were originally written for, who was meant to hear them, what they were meant to hear. And that's really something that is done well in community. And it's done, I hope, for many of you all. I think this great project that we're on right now, reading the Bible in a year, as I said last week, we did something like this at St. Albans, at St. Thomas, Medina, a few years ago. It was a wonderful transformative experience for the parish, and I hope it will be for this parish as well. So we read the Bible together, and I hope as you're reading the Bible too, that you have a commentary, a biblical, a Bible that contains a commentary, like the New Oxford Annotated Version or the HarperCollins Study Bible. Those are all great Bibles that contain notes that'll help you get a little closer to what the original context was. And the second thing I want to remind you that we said last week is how important language is. Understanding the language in which these early scriptures were read. And I used as a great example that piece from the Sermon on the Mount, right at the end of chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, he's talking to his disciples, he says, love your enemies and pray for them. Now there's a hard one, right? And particularly right now, as we're in this time of great conflict, love our enemies and pray for them. And he goes on to say, because you know what? He says, don't be so judgy. Don't be so judgy. The rain falls on the righteous and on the unrighteous. God's rain falls on the righteous and on the unrighteous. God's sun shines on the good and on the evil. Right? There's a thought, right? But then he says, and this is what trips a lot of people up. Then says, and be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Well, I want to tell you, when I read that, I just shut down. Perfect? I can be a lot of things, but perfect isn't one of them. Here's the key to this passage. The Greek word, remember the Christian Testament is all written in Koine Greek, which means in street Greek, the Greek of the people. The word that gets translated into Koine Greek, the original Hebrew that gets translated as perfect is tamim. And tamim does not mean perfect the way we understand it. Tamim means whole. To be whole as your Father in heaven is whole. Now that's something I can kind of wrap my arms around. Because the whole includes both the good and the bad, the righteous and the unrighteous. And for me, right, the whole includes the parts of myself that I like and the parts of myself I don't like so much. So the call to wholeness is what Jesus is offering to his disciples. But if we don't understand that, if we think that it's all about perfection, well, we kind of just throw up our hands. We'll never get there. I mean, I'm a neurotic perfectionist. And, what that means a lot of times is I just can't get started because I know whatever I do will never be perfect. So I just can't get started. But if I recognize that what I'm about to do won't be perfect, but I just give it my best efforts, put my best self into it, well, I can do that. And remember, I quoted that great Leonard Cohen. Zani. Yeah, right. We need Jad, help. Yeah, the crack in everything is how the light gets in. Right? There's a crack. Thank you. There's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. So you're cracked, my friends, and that's not a bad thing because that's how the light gets in. That's where transformation happens. Is when we recognize that we're cracked, we're broken, and then transformation can happen. So language is so important. And all that leads us to remember that when we read the Bible, we're engaged in a process of what's called exegesis. And the exegesis, the exegetic work, is to allow the text to speak for itself. To be open-minded and open-hearted as we approach the text, allow it to speak for itself. The opposite of exegesis, anybody know the opposite of exegesis? Eisegesis. Thank you, Mike. Eisegesis, which means we take our own prejudices, our own need to have the scripture say what we want it to say and impose it onto the scripture. That's what people do when they engage in something called proof texting, where they just lift something out of context and say, see, this proves these homosexuals are evil people. It's all proof texting. And so we want to not engage in that. Or at least we want to recognize that it's inevitable that we bring our own life experiences, we bring our own prejudices to any text we read. And just recognize that and see if we can let go of those prejudices and allow the text to speak for itself. So that's what we did last week. Now, this week I'd said that we were going to try to unpack the great themes of both the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Testament. Well, as I was putting these notes together this weekend, I realized that that was a huge project, and we wouldn't do either one of those justice if we tried to squeeze them into one session. So I want to talk this morning about the great themes of the Hebrew Scriptures, and then in December, I had another teaching piece scheduled, and we'll use that time to talk about the great themes of the Christian Testament, because I think in our course of reading we won't have gotten there yet. So that'll be time. So today let's talk about the themes of the Hebrew Scriptures. The foundational theme, the most important theme, is that the God that we meet in the Hebrew Scriptures is a relational God. It's a God who calls people into relationship. Now, I want to very firmly caution us not to be thinking about, and gosh, you hear this all the time, oh, that Old Testament God. He's a smiting God. He's a scary God. He's a bad God. I like that New Testament God. He's warm and fuzzy, and I don't feel threatened by that God. My dear friends, it's the same God. but we're going to see, I hope, as we read these Hebrew Scriptures with an open mind and an open heart, that we meet a God who deeply desires relationship with the creatures that God has created. And the whole Hebrew Scriptures are the story of God calling people into relationship, into what's called covenant. God calls people into covenant, and guess what? We screw up, right? We break the covenant. But what does God do? God says, I'm not going to smite you. I mean, there might be a little smiting along the way, but that's not the end of the story. As Deutsch said, he said it this morning, he says it often, the bad thing's not the last thing, right? Right? So that God is always faithfully chasing us, pursuing us, and calling us into covenant relationship. We rebel, there are consequences, but the faithful God pursues the covenant. And God's made covenant all throughout with men and women all throughout the Scriptures. God made a covenant with Adam and Eve. He said, I've given you all this, but one thing I don't want you to do. Right? We remember what that is, and they do it anyway. There are consequences to that. God makes a covenant with Noah. God said I'll say a little bit more about this, but remember, God said to Noah, I see the aroma of the sacrifice that you and your family are making, after the flood. The aroma of the sacrifice rises to heaven, and God is pleased with the aroma of that sacrifice. That's what do you think all the incense we do at 11 o'clock is about? Right? It's our prayers rising to heaven, and that's pleasing to God. And God says, okay, I won't ever. I know that people are evil from their youth, God says, but you know what? I've learned my lesson, and I won't ever again wipe people from the face of the earth. And then, because God's memory apparently isn't any better than mine, God says, to remind myself of this, I'm going to hang a sticky note in the sky. I'm going to create the rainbow, and that's going to remind me of the covenant that I've made with Noah. God makes a covenant with Abraham. God makes a covenant with Israel through Moses in the Torah. God says, I'll give you the law, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. God makes a covenant with the prophet Jeremiah, which I'll say more about in just a second. And so this relational God calls people into relationship with him. And then what else does he do? He calls the most unlikely people to follow him, to follow God. Abraham and Sarah, he calls Abraham and Sarah, and he says, I will make of you a great nation, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. And you know what Sarah's first reaction is? She laughs. Says, I'm too old. You know, according to the to the Bible, Abraham's 90 and she's not far behind. You know, that's a little old, isn't it? But God says, don't worry about that. I got this. So I'm calling you into my service. He calls Moses to be his follower. And guess what? Moses is a murderer and a stutterer. He's got a speech impediment. He said, you know, me? God says, you. He calls that unlikely person. He calls Samuel, the prophet Samuel. Remember, it's such a beautiful story. Samuel is in the service of his mentor Eli, and he's asleep one evening, and he keeps hearing, Samuel, Samuel, I'm calling you. And he goes into Eli and says, hey, yeah, I'm here. What do you want? Eli says, I didn't call you. 3 times Samuel hears the voice of the Lord calling him. And he says, but I'm a boy. He says, yeah, I got use for you anyway. Isaiah. Oh, I love this. I read this at my priesting. The first chapter, first 6 verses of Isaiah. The seraph appears to the Lord, and Isaiah says, "You can't call me. I'm a man of unclean lips." That's me. I'm a man of unclean lips. My wife will tell you all about that. Okay, I'm a man of unclean lips. But the seraph takes a burning coal and puts it on the mouth of Isaiah, cleanses his mouth, purifies him. So this man of unclean lips becomes a great prophet. So God calls these unlikely people into God's service. Now, back to this whole stuff about the smiting God and all that. Well, first off, let's just say this. If we could understand everything there is to know about God, you know what? That would be a God that's too small. That would be a God I could carry around right here. That God would be too small. Some of you are old enough to remember a book that was popular in the 50s and 60s by the English writer J.B. Phillips. Your God is too small, right? That would be a God that would be too small. So I love what the Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, who's a great, probably the 21st, late 20th and 21st century's greatest Protestant Hebrew scripture scholar, says, there's a conflict in the heart of God. A conflict in the heart of God. There is, on the one hand, this mighty magisterial God, this God who seems to be far off, who's transcendent. And on the other hand, there's a God who says, I'm as close to you as your own heart. I'm slow to anger, swift to forgive. My mercy is everlasting. So, you know, those two things fit together. So keep that in mind as you're reading the Hebrew scriptures and you think, God, this just doesn't, how can God do this? Well, remember that God has this peace that goes with him, that he is slow to anger and swift to forgive and abounds in abundant mercy. And so the relationship between God and God's creatures is, here's a 25-cent word, dialogic. The relationship is dialogic, meaning there's always a conversation that's going on between God and the people. There is a dialogue. And so that relationship is dynamic. And here's something to pay careful attention to as you're reading the scriptures. The relationship between God and God's people is risky. It's sure risky for human beings, because some of you know the story of the Ark of the Covenant that's traveling with the people, and these two poor guys who were following along. The law is you can't touch the ark. Well, the ark seems to be tilting, and what they go, oh gosh, we got to save the ark, and they just steady the wagon that's carrying the ark, and they're immediately struck dead. They violated the law. So it's risky, but it's also risky from God's perspective. Can you see how that would be? It's risk. God takes a risk when he calls a sinner like me into covenant relationship, God takes a risk and I'm going to disappoint God. Yet the faithful God still pursues. The faithful God still comes after me. So God takes risk. There's risk on God's side and there's risk on humanity's side. Okay, that's more to say about that, but I don't have time to say it. So let's take a real quick overview of the Hebrew Scriptures. The book of Genesis, which if you were here last week, you recall has several different writers, and it wasn't all written by one person at one time in one place. Oral tradition, scraps of different written traditions are pulled together by a group of scholars during the Babylonian exile. But the tradition that they're drawing from goes back hundreds of years. So in the book of Genesis, the first 11 chapters are called the prehistory. We learn, and remember, there are two creation stories. Genesis chapter 1, creation happens in 7 days. The heavens are divided from the earth. The light's divided from the darkness. The plants and animals come along, and finally, and at the end of each day, what does God say? It was good. And then God creates human beings out of the dust, kind of the very last thing God does. And what does God say about that? Very good. They are very good. So that's the transcendent God. That's the God who's way out there, right? Doing this remarkable act of creation. That's in the first and the beginning of the second chapter. Then in the third chapter, what happens? We get a kind of a different idea of God, a God that comes from a different writer, a different tradition. That's the God who creates a man, the Adam, out of the dust. And the Adam, but because this God is a relational God, God looks at the Adam and says, man, you need a friend. You need a companion. And so God reaches into the Adam, pulls out a rib, and lo and behold, there is a companion for God, the woman, Adam and Eve. And here's that covenant. And I'm going to tell the story because it's foundational for everything we want to know. It's going to happen later in the Bible. And my dear friends, it's foundational for our lives, this story of the creation. Adam and Eve, they're placed in this beautiful garden. They're placed in paradise. God says, here, it's all here for you. And I've created you to give you dominion over all of this beautiful creation. There's one thing I'm going to ask of you. See that tree over there? It's a beautiful tree. It's got very attractive fruit. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat that fruit. Well, you ever had a kid? Right? As soon as you tell the kid don't do that, well, what's the first thing they're going to do? And so they're things are cooking along pretty good, and all of a sudden, the serpent, the wily serpent, shows up, and he's very clever because he says to Eve, God's told you not to eat that fruit, the fruit of the knowledge of the tree and good and evil. But you know what? Go ahead and do it. Eat that fruit, because then you will be like God. There's the key. Then you will be like God. Who wouldn't want to be like God, right? Who wouldn't want that power? And so Eve does it, and she hands the fruit to Adam, and all of a sudden, right, their eyes are open. They realize they've really screwed up. Because, stop and think about it. Why did God say, don't eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Why would having the knowledge of good and evil be such a terrible thing to have? Anybody want to hazard a guess? There's ignorance is bliss. There's that. I'm the most blissful. Because it puts the human beings in the place of God. God is the one who judges good and evil. God is the one who judges. So human beings have decided that they're going to elbow God out of the judgment seat, and they're going to take over that project. which is a way of saying that our own egos, our egoic desires for power and control, that's at the heart of our egoic desires. The desires for power and control are put us in God's place. We sit on the judgment seat. And for the last, how many thousands of years, how's that worked out for us? See, so this is why I say this is foundational for reading scriptures and for understanding us as human beings. When we think that we need to be in control, that we need to be in charge of everything, right? That's when we get into trouble. When we sit on the judgment seat and we move God out of the judgment seat. So that's at the heart of everything that temptation that we all experience to be in charge. I want to be in control. One of the saddest images from ancient Greek mythology is the image of Atlas. You ever seen a picture of Atlas? Atlas is carrying the world around on his shoulders, and he's miserable. He's carrying everything on his shoulders. When we sit in the judgment seat, in God's judgment seat, and when we decide that it's up to us to judge good and evil and who's right and who's wrong, and you're bad and I'm good, it's exhausting. Okay, so that's why, and of course, in that second creation story, God shows up. The God who is as close to the human beings as their own hearts. We're told that God shows up in the cool of the evening. He's walking in the garden. It's such a beautiful, poetic image. God is walking in the garden, and he calls out, he says, Adam, where are you? And Adam says, I'm over here. Right? Because Adam and Eve, immediately when they ate the fruit, remember, they realized that they were naked. The shame came into the world. And God says, what have you done? And I love this. Adam says, she made me do it. He looks at him and said, wait a minute. And she points at the snake and said, the snake made me do it. Right? Don't you see? We're all, it's the blame game, right? We're all blaming somebody else for our own faults and misunderstandings. Poor snake doesn't have any arms, so he can't point at anybody. I mean, this is such a beautiful human story, isn't it? And Adam says, she made me do it. The devil made me do it. Come on. We all have agency. But when we get in trouble, we deny our own agency. Okay. So there's the creation story. There's the Noah story I mentioned just a minute ago. That's the first 11 chapters. Then the rest of the book of Genesis is the story of the patriarchs. I mentioned a moment ago, Abraham and Sarah. They're old, but God comes to Abraham and he says, I got a deal for you. I'm gonna give you the two most important things that anyone in that culture could have: land and sons. So I'm going to give you land and sons, and here's something very important for us to remember in these days of conflict in Israel and Palestine. He says to Abraham, I'm going to give you land and sons, and I'm going to bless you, and through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. So the blessing is given to Abraham, and Abraham's job is to do what God calls him to do and be a blessing to the whole world. And what does God call Abraham and Sarah to do? He doesn't just snap his fingers and say, here's land and here's sons. He sends them on a journey. They're living in the land of Haran, which is basically in modern day Iraq. And he sends them on this long journey down into Egypt. And some interesting and funny things happen when they're in Egypt. And then they come back. And along the way, as they're making their way back, he's getting a little impatient. And I love this about, this is how the people of Israel, the Jewish people, understand their relationship with God. Abraham goes out one night and he looks up and he says, wait a minute. You promised me all this stuff. It ain't happening yet. And God comes to him and he says, Abraham, look at the stars. look up in the sky at the stars. And Abraham does. And God says, as numerous as the stars are, so shall your descendants be. And Abraham takes courage from that. Abraham takes hope from that. And in fact, soon thereafter, Abraham and Sarah beget a child, beget Isaac. And there's something happens before that, but just we don't have time for that this morning. Ishmael comes along, but let's bookmark that for a second. They have Isaac, and do you know what Isaac ultimately calls himself? The son of laughter, right? Because remember, Sarah laughed when God said, I'm going to give you children. So Isaac becomes the son of laughter. Important to remember, God sends people on journeys. You know, God just doesn't do it like that. You got to go on a journey. You got to make a trip, and you're going to get frustrated along the way. You're going to get impatient along the way. But whatever your journey is and whatever you're called to do, just remember God's saying to Abraham, as God will say to you, look up in the stars at night. Your descendants will be as numerous as those stars are. So God sends people on a journey. Isaac and Rebekah, Isaac is born. Isaac takes a wife whose name is Rebekah, and they have a couple of kids, Esau and Jacob. Remember, a few Sundays back, Doyd preached, I think, a wonderful sermon using one of the texts that describes Esau and Esau's journey and Jacob. And here's what I want to tell us about that. You remember what happens? Well, so Jacob is a type that's very familiar to in ancient literature called a trickster. There's lots of literature that involves characters who are tricksters. Well, Jacob's a trickster. And Esau is his older brother, and so Esau is going to inherit his father's birthright. Esau comes in one day, he's been hunting, and he's famished. And Jacob's cooking up a bunch of red lentils. And Esau says, man, I'm hungry. And Jacob says, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a big bowl of soup if you will give me your birthright. Now, Esau's obviously not too bright, right? And Jacob's a trickster. So Esau says, you got it, man. I need a couple of those Big Macs. And so Jacob takes his birthright, and the next day Esau wakes up and says, man, did I make a big mistake. And that little guy tricked me. And Jacob says, whoa. And so he takes off running. And won't repeat all the stories, but Jacob goes on the run for many chapters in the book of Genesis. And along the way, he acquires 2 wives. He has a bunch of kids who ultimately become the 12 tribes of Israel. But he's always running away from Esau, always on the run, because Esau's made it very plain that if he catches Jacob, he's going to kill him. So by and by, it turns out that Jacob is tired of running. And so he stops, and with his whole family, he says, I've got to confront this. I have to confront the thing I'm running away from. Does that sound human? Got to confront the thing I'm running away from. And so he turns and he brings his wives, his family, all of the people who are following him. And he sees Esau at a distance. And Esau said as much, but he really intuits that actually Esau wants to reconcile. And here's what I want you to hear. As Jacob approaches Esau, he says, I see you, and I see forgiveness in you. When I look in your eyes, I see forgiveness. And when I look in your eyes, I see the face of God. Isn't that beautiful? So what does that tell us? The face of God is forgiveness. There's something we want to know about God. There's a theme that runs throughout the Hebrew scriptures, that God is a God of forgiveness, and it's very tangibly told to us in this really incarnational way. Okay, So Jacob has 12 sons, one of whom is Joseph. And remember the story of Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And, his brothers throw him in the pit because they're jealous of how, daddy loves Joseph best. And they take his coat, they throw him in the pit. But Joseph gets rescued. He goes down to Egypt and he makes good down there. He cozies up to Pharaoh and he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. Well, what happens is, of course, there's a famine in the land where Jacob and the rest of his sons are living, and they go down to Egypt, and they find, lo and behold, that Joseph is a big dude, and that there's plenty of grain in Egypt, but they're afraid to approach their brother because they're afraid that he's going to take revenge on them. Well, to make a very long story short, Joseph says, "No, you are my family. I'm here for you. Come." And Joseph looks at them and says, "I forgive you because what you meant for evil, God turned to good." So, right? Beautiful story, right? Another story of God's forgiveness. So there's what we're learning about God. My goodness, I'm running short here. God next calls. So they go down to Egypt and they multiply. There are a whole bunch of them. But then I love the way that Genesis ends, because we're told that the Pharaoh who had been Joseph's patron dies, and he's replaced by a new patron, a new Pharaoh, who looks at all these people who are now populating his realm and sees that they're a threat. And so he enslaves them. And then this kid called Moses comes along. Remember, Moses is found in the bulrushes by one of this baby's found in the bulrushes. That's a story I loved when I was a little kid. All right, it's found by one of Pharaoh's daughters in the bulrushes, and he grows up, and one day he sees a man who he's identified as a Hebrew. The people of Israel don't exist yet. There's no nation yet. But there's just this group of people who are called Hebrews, who are basically slaves. He sees an Egyptian official beating this Hebrew, and so he goes to the Egyptian official and he kills him, murders him. So now he's on the run. So he goes into sort of a neighboring country. Think about sort of Sinai area, to the people of Midian, and he eventually marries a daughter of the priest of Midian. So see, he marries somebody who's out of the tribe. So he marries the daughter of the priest of Midian, and one day he's tending his father-in-law's flock, and he's up on a mountain, and he's just kind of minding his own business. And then he looks over this way and sees. Remember what does he see? Anybody remember what he sees? He sees a burning bush, and he's looking at the bush, and the bush isn't being consumed. It's just burning. And he draws close to the bush, and a voice comes out of the bush and says, "Wait a minute, don't get any closer. You're standing on holy ground. So you can't get too close to this burning bush." And Moses says, "Who are you?" That's a question I'd be asking. Who are you? And the voice from the bush says, "I am who I am." Isn't that beautiful? I am who I am. And the writer of this story is called the J writer. And J stands for Yahweh. Because I am who I am. In Hebrew, there are no vowels, there are only consonants. And I am who I am is written as YHWH, which is pronounced Yahweh. Now, here's a little exercise for you to take into your prayer time. Yahweh. Say that with me. Yahweh. 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 The name of God is on your breath. Yahweh. Yahweh. Isn't that beautiful? The name of God is as close to you as your breath. And that's the God that Moses meets in that burning bush. And God later says to Moses, Moses, these people need a leader. I'm going to deliver them from Egypt, and you're going to be their leader. And so, there are lots of plagues and stuff that happens along the way, and they cross the Red Sea, and Pharaoh, the great old gospel sing, Pharaoh's army get drowned. Oh, Lordy, don't you weep, oh, Mary. Okay, so Pharaoh's army gets drowned in the Red Sea. They cross the other side, and God says, I got a place for you to live. Remember that land that he'd promised Abraham about 500 years before that? Well, it's finally going to happen. I got a place for you to live. But you know what? There's not going to be a direct line there, is there? No, you're going to be in the wilderness for 40 years. Why do you think God called them to be in the wilderness for 40 years instead of just sending them in a straight line to the promised land? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Yeah, Clip. Thank you. Clip says they had to grow up. Exactly. They had to grow up. In the wilderness is where their character is formed, where they learn how to be a people, where they learn how to, is 2 generations pass. 40 years is 2 generations. Now, 40 years, who knows whether they're for 40 years. 40 is a number that you see throughout Scripture. It just means a long time. So they're in the wilderness for a long time. Who else was in the wilderness for 40 days? Right, Jesus, right? Okay, so they're in the wilderness for 40 years, and as Clip says, they're growing up. Their character is being formed, and then this great event happens to them when they're in the wilderness. Moses goes up on top of Mount Sinai, and what happens? He gets the law, and there's the next covenant. God says, "I will be your God. I'm giving you the law, and you will be my people." Of course, what's the very next thing that happens? Moses comes down off the mountain and sees, man, they're having a party. And they've made a gold, they forgot about God. And so they made a golden calf, and they're worshiping a golden calf. And, those of you who are old enough to remember the 10 Commandments, Charlton Heston throws the tablets down. But that's not the end of the story. God keeps calling them back into relationship. And so they finally get through the wilderness in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You can have a great time reading Leviticus. But Leviticus is important. And all the rules that you're going to see in the book of Leviticus, you ever ask yourself, what are all these rules all about? The rules people by God to make a community. You got to have, if you're going to live in community, you got to have some rules, you got to have some boundaries. And that's why God gives them all these rules. And so it's important to read the book of Leviticus. Okay, so they come into the land. Judges and Joshua tell the story of the people who come into the land, and they're contradictory. In Joshua, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho and the walls come tumbling down. In Joshua, it's a story of the people coming to the land by conquest. In Judges, which is really probably more like what really happened, they kind of filter into the land. And of course, there are people that are already living there. And yeah, do they get in conflict with some of the people who are already living there? Sure they do. But it's really not the same kind of smiting energy that you get in the book of Joshua. And in Judges, the people are ruled by a coterie of people called the judges. The people say, I think we need a leader today. And so they elect somebody to be a judge. And interestingly enough, some of those judges are women, right? Deborah, the song of Deborah that you'll see in the book of Judges is a beautiful evocation of the people being guided by a woman. And bonus read when you get to Judges, I won't give you the spoiler alert. Well, I won't give you the spoiler. There's a woman called Jael, Jael. You know, yeah. So here's a free woman who knows about jail, right? Jail has an abusive husband, and man, is she going to have some fun. So just read the story of jail when you get to the book of Judges. Okay, now, so God calls Samuel. The people say, you know, we're tired of these judges. We need a king. And God says, you sure about that? Yeah, we're sure about that. So Saul gets raised up as a king, and Saul's a disaster. He gets followed by David. And now we're really at the heart of the story. David is a man whose feet are made of clay, right? David's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. You know, David's a big sinner. You know, David falls in love with Uriah's wife, has an affair with her, and then sends Uriah, who's one of his generals, to the front line of the war they're having with the Assyrians because he knows he'll be killed there. And so Nathan, the court prophet, who's David's conscience, says, okay, buddy, God's going to allow you. You're still called to be a king, but you're going to have some making up to do. So there's David, and David becomes the focus of all of Israel's hope, you know, down through the years. Because when David is the king, what's going on? The kingdom is united. All the warring states are at peace, and you know, everything's really good. And so that time is looked back upon by the people of Israel as being a golden time. And so David dies. He's got a son named Solomon. We know the wisdom of Solomon. Solomon had 900 concubines. He must have been exhausted. But Solomon builds a temple where all worship is going to be centralized and things are great. And then Solomon dies. And Solomon is succeeded by a bunch of yokels, you know, much less successful. And so not too long after Solomon dies, the kingdom is divided. There's the northern kingdom, whose capital is at Bethel, and the southern kingdom, Judah, whose capital is at Jerusalem. And there are all kinds of foreign relations issues. The Assyrian Empire is rising. The people in both of the kingdoms are not following the law. They're drifting away and drifting apart from their relationship with God. They're out of relationship with God. And so what happens? God calls a group called the prophets. The prophets get raised up. The first prophet that we meet is a guy named Amos. And Amos is we're told he's a sheep herder and a vine dresser. And when we meet Amos, and so he's just a regular guy, in other words. And so when we meet Amos, we immediately see that he's really ticked off. I mean, he's ticked off. And just the imprecations just flow one right after the other from his mouth. And why is he ticked off? Two reasons. The huge gap between the rich and the poor. That's not part of God's plan. Is it a few people should be wealthy and everybody else should suffer? Sound familiar? The second reason he's ticked off is because the people's worship is fallen away from true worship of Yahweh. In fact, they're beginning to adopt some of the practices of these orgiastic cults that are in the neighborhood among the Gentiles. And one of the things that happens in these orgiastic cults is that the ruler, the king, is the one who's ultimately worshipped. And the people are starting to get into that. So they're starting to worship whoever the king is rather than worshiping God. And so that becomes idolatry. And I guess the modern analog to that would be this rise of Christian nationalism. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, right. We're all of a sudden, the flag and the over identification with the state or with some version of the state is what's important. We got 5 minutes until you have to be in the service. So we're going to, unfortunately, I think that's got to be a wrap. But I think I hope this gives you some, an entryway into reading the Old Testament. I love the prophets. The prophets have as much to say to us today as they had to say to the people in their own time. So I look forward to us reading the prophets together by and by here, and allowing yourself to imagine what the prophets would be saying today to us. Okay, folks, thank you.